Susan Miller woke up at 5 in the morning. Her alarm clock made a loud beeping sound that pulled her from a deep sleep. She reached over and turned it off. The room was still dark. Susan sat up in bed and took a deep breath. Today was an important day. She was starting a new undercover job for the FBI. Susan had been working for the FBI for 8 years now. She was good at her job. Very good. People at the office said she was one of the best agents when it came to undercover work. Susan could become someone else completely, and no one would know she was an FBI agent. She got out of bed and went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. Susan had blonde hair that went down to her shoulders, blue eyes, and a face that people said was forgettable. This was perfect for her job. Being forgettable meant people didn't remember her, which was exactly what an undercover agent needed. Susan took a quick shower, then went to her closet. Today she wasn't Susan Miller anymore. Today she was Kate Bennett, a marketing executive from New York who was flying to Chicago for a business meeting. Susan picked out clothes that Kate would wear: a gray skirt that went down to her knees, a white blouse, and a navy blue blazer. She put on small pearl earrings and a silver watch. Nothing flashy, nothing that would stand out too much. As she made coffee in her kitchen, Susan thought about the case. For the last 3 months, the FBI had been getting reports about a TSA officer at LaGuardia Airport. The officer's name was Paul Wright. 6 women had made complaints about him. They said he picked them for random security checks, then touched them in ways that were not appropriate during the pat-downs. He also made comments about their bodies and asked personal questions. Some women said he had even asked them out on dates while he was checking them. The problem was that each time a woman made a complaint to the airport, nothing happened. The complaints seemed to disappear. The FBI thought someone at the airport was protecting Officer Wright. That's why they needed an undercover agent to catch him in the act. Susan's phone rang. It was Frank Thompson, her boss at the FBI. Good. "Morning, Miller, are you ready?" Frank asked. "Yes, sir, I'm about to leave for the airport," Susan replied. "Remember, we need solid evidence. Your pin has a camera in it and there's a recording device in your purse. Make sure both are working before you go through security," Frank said. "I will." "Don't worry," Susan said. "Wright usually works at checkpoint B. His shift starts at 7. Your flight is at 9, so you should reach his checkpoint around 7:30, Frank continued. "Got it. What about backup?" Susan asked. "Agents Kelly and Martinez will be at the airport. They'll be watching from a distance. If anything goes wrong, they'll step in," Frank assured her. "I don't think that will be necessary, but it's good to know," Susan said. After she hung up, Susan checked the recording devices. The camera in her pin was working fine. It was small and looked just like a normal lapel pin with a little American flag on it. The recording device in her purse was hidden in what looked like a normal power bank for charging phones. Susan finished her coffee, grabbed her suitcase, and left her apartment. She took a taxi to LaGuardia Airport. On the way, she reviewed the file on Officer Paul Wright one more time. Paul Wright was 36 years old. He had been working for the TSA for 3 years. Before that, he had been a security guard at a mall. He had no criminal record, but there had been 2 complaints about him at his old job too. Both complaints were from women who said he followed them around the mall and asked personal questions. The mall had let him go after the second complaint. Tupper. Taxi dropped Susan off at LaGuardia at 7:15. She paid the driver and walked into the airport. She had a small suitcase that she was going to check in and a purse with her work documents. The airport was busy with morning travelers rushing to catch their flights. Susan went to the check-in counter for her airline. She handed over her fake ID and credit card in the name of Kate Bennett. The airline worker didn't look twice at them. Susan checked her suitcase and got her boarding pass. "Gate 22, the airline worker said. "You'll want to go through security checkpoint B to get there." "Thank you," Susan said, taking her boarding pass. She walked toward security checkpoint B, her heart beating a little faster. This was the part of the job she loved, the moment before everything started, the moment when she stepped fully into her fake identity. Susan got in line at the checkpoint. She looked around, trying to spot Officer Wright. There were 4 TSA officers working at this checkpoint. 3 men and 1 woman. Susan looked at each of the men. One was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair. Another was young, probably in his 20s. The third man was tall with a buzz cut. He looked to be in his 30s. That had to be right. Susan watched him as the line moved forward. Officer Wright seemed to be paying special attention to women traveling alone. He was friendly with them, smiling and chatting. With men and families, he was all business. No smiles, no chat, just doing his job. When Susan was 3 people away from the front of the line, she saw Officer Wright pull a young woman aside for additional screening. The woman looked nervous. Wright put his hand on her lower back as he led her to the screening area. The touch was not necessary and lasted too long. Susan made a mental note of this. Now Susan was next in line. Officer Wright looked at her and smiled. "ID and boarding pass, please," he said. Susan handed them over. Wright looked at her ID, then at her face, then back at the ID. "Kate Bennett," he said, reading her fake name out loud. "Traveling to Chicago today?" "Yes, for work," Susan replied. Wright handed back her ID and boarding pass. "Business or pleasure?" he asked. "Business," Susan said shortly. She didn't want to engage too much yet. "What kind of business are you in?" Wright pressed. "Marketing," Susan replied. "Interesting," Wright said, though he didn't sound interested in marketing at all. His eyes moved down to look at Susan's body, then back up to her face. "Please put your purse and shoes on the conveyor belt and step through the scanner." Susan did as she was told. She put her purse on the conveyor belt, took off her shoes, and stepped through the scanner. The scanner beeped. Susan knew it would. The FBI had made sure of that. They had given her a bracelet with a tiny bit of metal that would set off the scanner, but was small enough that it wouldn't be obvious. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for additional screening," Wright said. He was trying to sound professional, but Susan could see the glint in his eyes. This was what he had been waiting for. "Is there a problem?" Susan asked, pretending to be confused. "Just a routine check," Wright said. "Please come with me." He put his hand on Susan's elbow and guided her to a small area off to the side. His touch lingered longer than it should have. Susan felt a surge of anger but kept her face neutral. She was Kate Bennett now, a normal woman who had no idea what was coming. "Is this really necessary?" Susan asked, making her voice sound a little nervous. "My flight leaves soon." "Don't worry," Wright said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This won't take long. Unless you want it to." Susan looked at him, letting a flash of alarm show on her face. Wright's smile grew wider. The trap was set. Now all Susan had to do was let Officer Paul Wright show his true colors. The camera in her pin was recording everything. Soon, the FBI would have all the evidence they needed to put this man away and make the airport safe for women travelers again. Susan took a deep breath. "Fine," she said. "Let's get this over with." Officer Wright had no idea who he was really dealing with, but he was about to find out. Officer Paul Wright led Susan to a small room off to the side of the main security area. The room had a table and 2 chairs. There was a window, but the blinds were closed. Susan noticed there were no security cameras in this room. That was odd. Most areas in an airport had cameras. She wondered if Wright had chosen this room on purpose. "Please have a seat, Ms. Bennett," Wright said, pointing to one of the chairs. Susan sat down. She placed her purse on her lap, making sure the recording device inside was still working. The little light on her power bank was green. That meant it was recording. "So you're going to Chicago for work?" Wright asked. He was standing too close to her chair. Susan could smell his cologne. It was too strong and made her want to cough. "Yes," Susan replied. "I have a marketing meeting there." "What company do you work for?" Wright asked. His eyes were not on her face. They were looking at her body. "Johnson and Smith Marketing," Susan said. This was the fake company the FBI had created for her cover story. "Never heard of it," Wright said. He walked around the table, still standing. He was not sitting down across from her like he should have been doing. "Must not be very big." "It's small but growing," Susan said. She looked at her watch. My flight leaves in an hour. Can we please get this over with? What's the rush? Wright said, smiling. His smile was not friendly. It was the smile of someone who knew he had power over another person. We have plenty of time. Susan did not like the way he said, plenty of time. She kept her face calm, but inside she was getting angry. This man had done this to other women who were just trying to travel, women who didn't have FBI training, women who might have been scared. I need to check your bag, Wright said, pointing to her purse. Susan handed over her purse, careful not to turn off the recording device. Wright took it and started looking through it. He was not wearing gloves. TSA officers were supposed to wear gloves when checking people's belongings. Nice wallet, Wright said, taking out Susan's fake Kate Bennett wallet. He opened it and looked at her credit cards. You must make good money in marketing. It's okay, Susan said. She wanted to tell him to stop touching her personal items, but Kate Bennett wouldn't know that what he was doing was against TSA rules, so she stayed quiet. Wright put the wallet down and kept looking through her purse. He took out her phone, her keys, a small makeup bag, and a pack of gum. He opened the makeup bag and looked inside. There was nothing unusual in there, just lipstick, mascara, and a small mirror. You don't need much makeup, Wright said, looking at Susan's face. You're pretty without it. Susan felt uncomfortable. This was not something a TSA officer should say to a traveler, but she nodded and said, Thank you. Wright finally put her makeup bag down. Now I need to do a pat-down, he said. Please stand up and put your arms out to the sides. Susan stood up and held her arms out. Wright walked behind her. She could feel him standing very close to her back. I'm going to check for any hidden items, Wright said. His voice was different now. It was lower and softer. He put his hands on Susan's shoulders and moved them down her arms. His touch was light, but his hands moved slowly. Too slowly. This was not how a professional pat-down should feel. Wright moved his hands to Susan's back. He ran them down her spine and then to her sides. When his hands reached her waist, they stopped and lingered there. You're in good shape, Wright said. Do you work out? Sometimes, Susan said. She kept her voice steady, but she was making mental notes of every inappropriate touch and comment. Wright moved his hands to Susan's hips. Again, his touch lingered too long. Turn around, please, Wright said. Susan turned to face him. Wright was standing very close to her. Too close. She could see a small drop of sweat on his forehead. Arms out again, please, he said. Susan held her arms out. Wright put his hands on her shoulders again and moved them down the front of her arms. Then, he moved his hands to her collarbone and down the sides of her ribs. His thumbs brushed the sides of her breasts. It was quick, but it was not an accident. Susan felt a flash of anger. This man was using his job to touch women in ways that made them uncomfortable. He was abusing his power. She wanted to stop the act right now and arrest him, but she needed more evidence. She needed him to cross more lines so that he couldn't claim it was just a misunderstanding. Almost done, Wright said. His eyes met hers, and Susan saw something in them that made her skin crawl. It was hunger. This man enjoyed making women feel powerless. Wright moved his hands down to Susan's legs. He ran them down the outside of her thighs, then up the inside. His hands went too high, almost touching her in private areas. Susan stepped back. That's enough, she said firmly. Wright straightened up. Just doing my job, ma'am, he said, but he was smiling again. That same smile that said he had power and he knew it. Are we done now? Susan asked. Can I catch my flight? Not quite, Wright said. I need to ask you a few questions. He pointed to the chair, and Susan sat down again. Wright finally sat down across from her, but he leaned forward, putting his elbows on the table. His face was too close to hers. Have you ever been stopped for a security check before? Wright asked. No, Susan said. First time, huh? Wright said, and his smile got wider. Don't worry, I'll be gentle. The way he said gentle made Susan want to reach across the table and slap him. But she stayed in character. Kate Bennett would be uncomfortable but wouldn't know exactly why what he was saying was wrong. Look, I really need to catch my flight. Susan said, looking at her watch again. What hotel are you staying at in Chicago? Wright asked, ignoring her comment about her flight. The Marriott downtown, Susan said. This was part of her cover story. Nice place, Wright said. I've been to Chicago a few times. Maybe we could get a drink next time you're there. Or next time I'm in New York. Susan blinked. Are you asking me out? Wright leaned back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. Just being friendly. Is that a problem? I think it's inappropriate while you're doing your job, Susan said. Kate Bennett would say something like this, she thought. A normal woman would point out that this wasn't okay. Wright's face changed. His smile disappeared. I'm just trying to be nice, he said. His voice had an edge to it now. Some women appreciate that. I'd appreciate being able to catch my flight, Susan said. Wright stood up suddenly. Fine, he said. You can go. He picked up her purse and held it out to her, but when she reached for it, he didn't let go right away. Maybe we'll see each other again, Kate Bennett from New York, he said. He finally let go of her purse. Susan put her purse on her shoulder and walked to the door. She could feel Wright watching her as she left. As soon as she was out of the room, Susan took a deep breath. She had what she needed. The recording would show Wright's inappropriate touching and comments. Now she needed to find a quiet place to call her boss, Frank Thompson. Susan found a bathroom and went into a stall. She took out her phone and called Frank. Thompson, Frank answered. It's Miller, Susan said quietly. I got it. All of it. The touching, the comments, the asking me out. He did everything the other women reported and more. Good work, Frank said. Agents Kelly and Martinez are waiting near your gate. Find them and give them the recording device. Then get on your flight like nothing happened. Should I come back? To New York tomorrow? Susan asked. Yes, Frank said. We'll make the arrest when you return. We need to prepare the case properly. Understood, Susan said. She hung up the phone and left the bathroom. Susan walked to her gate. She spotted Agents Kelly and Martinez sitting near the window. Kelly was a woman with short brown hair, pretending to read a book. Martinez was a man in a business suit looking at his phone. Susan sat down near them and pretended to look in her purse for something. She took out the power bank recording device and dropped it into Kelly's open bag on the floor. Kelly didn't look up from her book, but she shifted her bag closer to her feet. The announcement came for Susan's flight to Chicago. She got up and joined the line to board the plane. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, she glanced. Back at the security checkpoint, Officer Paul Wright was watching her from a distance. When he saw her looking, he raised his hand in a small wave. Susan turned away and boarded the plane. Tomorrow she would return to New York, and Officer Paul Wright would learn that the woman he had harassed was an FBI agent who had just gathered all the evidence needed to end his career and possibly send him to jail. Susan's flight to Chicago took 2 hours. She tried to relax, but her mind kept going over what had happened with Officer Wright. She felt angry about how he had treated her. She knew that many women had gone through the same thing with him, but they didn't have the power to do anything about it. Susan did have that power, and she was going to use it. When the plane landed in Chicago, Susan turned on her phone. She had a text message from Frank Thompson. Call me when you land. Susan left the plane and found a quiet corner in the airport. She called Frank. Miller, good work today, Frank said when he answered. We've reviewed the recording. It's exactly what we needed. What's the next step? Susan asked. We're preparing the arrest warrant now, Frank said. We'll pick Wright up tomorrow after his shift ends. I need you to fly back to New York in the morning. Be at the office by noon for debriefing. Got it, Susan said. She spent the night at the Marriott Hotel in downtown Chicago. Her room was on the 25th floor with a view of Lake Michigan. It was a nice room, but Susan didn't enjoy it much. She ordered room service for dinner and went to bed early. She needed to be fresh for tomorrow. Susan woke up at 6 the next morning. She showered, got dressed, and packed her small suitcase. She checked out of the hotel and took a taxi to the airport. Her flight back to New York was at 8:30. When Susan arrived at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, she checked in for her flight and went through security. The TSA officers here were professional. They didn't make inappropriate comments or touch her in ways that made her uncomfortable. This was how airport security was supposed to work. Susan's flight back to New York was smooth. She landed at LaGuardia at 11:15. She didn't go through the same terminal where Officer Wright worked. She didn't want to risk running into him before the FBI was ready to make the arrest. Susan took a taxi straight to the FBI office in downtown Manhattan. She arrived at 11:45, 15 minutes early for her meeting with Frank. The FBI office was in a tall building with mirrored windows. Susan showed her badge to the security guard in the lobby and took the elevator to the 12th floor. When she stepped out of the elevator, she saw Frank waiting for her. "Right on time, Miller," Frank said with a smile. "Come on, the team is waiting." Frank led Susan to a conference room. Inside, there were 4 other FBI agents sitting around a table. Susan recognized Agents Kelly and Martinez from the airport. The other 2 were Agent Lisa Brown and Agent John Davis. They were all part of the team working on the case against Officer Wright. "Miller, great job yesterday," Agent Brown said as Susan sat down. "The recording is perfect. Wright can't claim it was a misunderstanding." "He crossed so many lines," Agent Martinez added. "Sexual harassment, abuse of power, inappropriate touching. The airport administration won't be able to protect him this time." "What about the other complaints?" Susan asked. "The ones that disappeared?" "We're looking into that," Frank said. "We think someone high up in airport security has been covering for Wright. We're going to find out who." Agent Davis pushed a folder across the table to Susan. "Here's the plan for today. We're going to arrest Wright when he leaves work at 4. We want you there, Miller. You're the victim in this case." Susan opened the folder and read the arrest plan. The FBI would wait for Wright in the parking lot. They would arrest him as he walked to his car. Susan would be there to identify him, but she wouldn't approach him directly. "This looks good," Susan said, closing the folder. "What time do we leave?" 3 o'clock, Frank said. "That gives us plenty of time to get to the airport and get in position." The team spent the next hour going over the details of the case. They reviewed the recording from Susan's camera and the audio from her purse. They had clear evidence of Wright's inappropriate behavior. At 2 o'clock, the team took a break for lunch. They ordered sandwiches and ate them in the conference room. At 2:45, they gathered their things and headed down to the parking garage. They would take 2 FBI cars to the airport. Susan rode with Frank and Agent Brown. The other 3 agents were in the second car. As they drove to LaGuardia, Susan felt a mix of emotions. She was proud of the work she had done, but she was also thinking about the women who had suffered because of Wright's behavior. "You're quiet," Frank said, looking at Susan in the rearview mirror. "Just thinking about the other victims," Susan said. 6 women filed complaints that we know of. How many others didn't say anything because they were too scared or didn't think anyone would believe them? "That's why this work is important," Frank said. "We're not just stopping Wright, we're sending a message that this behavior won't be tolerated." They arrived at LaGuardia at 3:30. Frank parked in a special area reserved for law enforcement. The second car parked next to them. The team got out and put on their FBI jackets. Susan didn't put on a jacket. She wasn't supposed to look like an FBI agent yet. Frank led the team to the employee parking lot. They found a spot near Wright's car, which they had identified from his employee records. It was a blue Ford Mustang, about 5 years old. "Okay, everyone knows the plan," Frank said. "Brown and Davis, you take positions at the south end of the lot. Martinez and Kelly, you're with me at the north end. Miller, you stay by the car. When Wright shows up, you give us the signal, then step back. We'll make the arrest." The team moved into position. Susan stood near a large SUV that was parked 2 spaces away from Wright's Mustang. From here, she could see Wright coming, but he wouldn't immediately see her. At 4:05, Susan saw Wright walking across the parking lot. He was still in his TSA uniform. He was walking with another man, also in a TSA uniform. They were laughing about something. Susan sent a text message to Frank. "Target approaching from the east, has company." Frank texted back, "Acknowledged. Wait for him to reach his car." Susan watched as Wright and the other man walked closer. They stopped about 5 cars away from Wright's Mustang. The other man said something to Wright, then walked off in another direction. Wright continued toward his car alone. Wright was about 20 feet away from his car when he saw Susan. He stopped walking. A smile spread across his face. It was the same smile he had given her at the airport, the one that made her skin crawl. "Kate." "Bennett?" Wright called out. "What a surprise. Did you miss your flight yesterday?" Susan didn't answer. She just stared at him. Wright started walking toward her. "Or did you come back to take me up on that drink offer?" he asked. Susan raised her hand, giving the signal to Frank and the team. Suddenly, FBI agents appeared from both ends of the parking lot. They moved quickly, surrounding Wright. "Paul Wright," Frank said loudly. "FBI, you're under arrest for sexual harassment and abuse of authority." Wright's face changed from surprise to shock to anger in the span of seconds. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Agent Martinez grabbed Wright's arms and pulled them behind his back. He put handcuffs on Wright's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." Martinez began reading Wright his rights. Wright looked at Susan with confusion. "What's going on?" "Kate?" Susan took out her FBI badge and held it up. "Special Agent Susan Miller, FBI," she said. "You're being arrested for the sexual harassment and inappropriate touching you performed during your security check yesterday. We have it all on video." The color drained from Wright's face. "You were undercover? This is entrapment." "No, it's not," Frank said. "You chose to behave that way. Agent Miller was just there to document what you've been doing to women for months." Wright struggled against the handcuffs. "You can't do this to me. I have rights." "Yes, you do," Susan said calmly. "And you're being read those rights right now. Maybe you should listen." Wright glared at Susan as Martinez finished reading him his rights. Then Martinez and Kelly led Wright to one of the FBI cars. Frank turned to Susan. "Good work, Miller. Really good work." Susan watched as Wright was put in the back of the FBI car. She felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that he wouldn't be able to harass any more women at the airport. "What happens now?" Susan asked. "Now we dig deeper," Frank said. "We find out who's been covering for Wright at the airport, and we talk to the other victims, see if they want to press charges too." Susan nodded. This case was bigger than just one bad TSA officer. It was about a system that had allowed him to keep harassing women even after they complained. But now, that system was going to be exposed and things were going to change. The next morning, Susan arrived at the FBI office early. She wanted to check on the progress of the case against Paul Wright. When she got to her desk, she found a note from Frank asking her to come to his office right away. Susan walked down the hallway to Frank's office. The door was open, but she knocked anyway. "Come in, Miller," Frank said, looking up from his computer. Susan entered and sat down in the chair across from Frank's desk. "How did it go with Wright yesterday after the arrest?" she asked. "Not well for him," Frank said with a small smile. "We questioned him for 3 hours. At first he denied everything, said he was just doing his job. Said you were flirting with him." Susan made a face. "That's not true." "We know," Frank said. "We showed him the video from your camera pin. His face when he saw it was priceless. He knew he was caught." "Did he admit to harassing the other women too?" Susan asked. Frank nodded. "Eventually, yes. After he saw the video, he started talking. Admitted to being friendly with female travelers who caught his eye. Those were his words, and being friendly." "That's not what I would call it," Susan said. "Me neither," Frank agreed. "But here's where it gets interesting. Wright told us who's been making the complaints disappear." Susan leaned forward in her chair. "Who?" "Edward Simmons," Frank said. "He's the head of security at LaGuardia. Wright says Simmons has been protecting him and other TSA officers for years." "Why would Simmons do that?" Susan asked. "According to Wright, Simmons doesn't think women should be taken seriously when they complain about stuff like this," Frank explained. "He calls them oversensitive and dramatic." Susan felt her anger rising again. "So Simmons just throws away their complaints?" "Worse," Frank said. "He keeps a file on each woman who complains. Looks for dirt on them. If they push their complaint too hard, he threatens to expose whatever he finds." "That's blackmail," Susan said. "Exactly," Frank nodded. and we're going to get him for it. That's why I called you in here. We're planning a raid on Simmons' office today. We want you to come along." "Why me?" Susan asked. "Because you're the face of this case now," Frank said. "The women who filed complaints against Wright are coming forward. 3 of them have agreed to press charges. They want to meet you." Susan was surprised. "They want to meet me?" "Yes," Frank said. "You did what they couldn't do. You got evidence against Wright that couldn't be ignored. You're a hero to them." Susan didn't feel like a hero. She had just been doing her job, but she understood why these women would see it differently. "When do they want to meet?" Susan asked. "They're coming here at 11, Frank said. "The raid on Simmons's office is at 1. Busy day ahead." Susan nodded. "I'll be ready." She left Frank's office and went back to her desk. She had paperwork to finish from the arrest yesterday. As she worked, she thought about the women who had been harassed by Wright. They had tried to speak up, only to have their complaints dismissed by Simmons. It wasn't right. At 11 o'clock, Frank came to Susan's desk. "They're here," he said, "in conference room 2. Susan followed Frank to the conference room. Inside, 3 women were sitting at the table. They looked nervous but determined. Frank made the introductions. "Ladies, this is Special Agent Susan Miller. She's the one who went undercover to catch Officer Wright. Susan, this is Laura Green, Melissa Jones, and Diane Rivera. They all filed complaints against Wright in the past 3 months." Susan shook hands with each woman. "It's nice to meet you all," she said. "Thank you for what you did," Laura said. She was a young woman with red hair. "I filed a complaint against Wright 2 months ago. Nothing happened. I thought I was going crazy, like maybe I'd imagined how inappropriate he was." "You didn't imagine it," Susan assured her. "Wright's behavior was completely inappropriate, and now we have proof." "Will we have to testify in court?" Melissa asked. She looked worried. She was older than the other 2 women, maybe in her 40s. "Possibly," Frank said. "But with the video evidence we have, there's a good chance Wright will take a plea deal to avoid trial." "What about Simmons?" Diane asked. She was a tall woman with dark skin and braided hair. "After I filed my complaint, he called me. Said he knew about a speeding ticket I got last year. Said it would be a shame if my employer found out about my reckless behavior. I was scared, so I dropped the complaint. Simmons will be arrested today," Frank told her. "We're raiding his office this afternoon. We believe he's kept records of his blackmail attempts. If we find those records, he'll be facing serious charges." The women looked relieved. They spent the next hour telling Susan and Frank about their experiences with Wright and Simmons. Their stories were similar to Susan's, but worse in some ways. Wright had been more aggressive with them because he didn't think they had any power to stop him, and Simmons had made sure they didn't. After the meeting, the women thanked Susan again and left. Susan felt even more determined to bring both Wright and Simmons to justice. At 1 o'clock, Susan, Frank, and a team of 6 other FBI agents headed to LaGuardia Airport. They had a search warrant for Simmons's office and an arrest warrant for Simmons himself. When they arrived at the airport, they went straight to the Security Administration offices. A secretary tried to stop them, but Frank showed her the warrants. "Mr. Simmons is in a meeting," the secretary said. "Not anymore," Frank replied, pushing past her. The team went down a hallway to a door marked Edward Simmons, Head of Security. Frank knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for an answer. Simmons was sitting at his desk, talking on the phone. He was a large man with gray hair and a red face. He looked up in surprise when the FBI team entered his office. "I'll call you back," Simmons said into the phone, then hung up. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Frank stepped forward and placed the warrants on Simmons's desk. "Edward Simmons, I'm Special Agent Frank Thompson with the FBI. We have a warrant to search your office and a warrant for your arrest on charges of obstruction of justice, blackmail, and abuse of power." Simmons' face turned even redder. "This is ridiculous. I haven't done anything wrong." "We'll let a judge decide that," Frank said. "Agent Miller, please read Mr. Simmons his rights while we search his office." Susan stepped forward as the other agents began searching the room. Simmons glared at her. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Special Agent Susan Miller, Susan said. I'm the FBI agent who went undercover to expose Paul Wright's harassment of female travelers. The harassment you helped cover up. Simmons's eyes widened. You're the one who got Wright arrested. He said it was some woman named Kate. That was me, Susan said. And now I'm arresting you. She began reading Simmons his Miranda rights. As Susan was speaking, one of the other agents called out, "Found it!" He was holding a key he had found in Simmons' desk drawer. The agent went to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office and tried the key. The cabinet opened. Inside were dozens of files. The agent pulled out one and opened it. "It's all here," he said. Files on women who filed complaints, personal information, things he could use against them. This one has photos of a woman leaving a hotel with a man who isn't her husband. Simmons jumped up from his chair. "Those are private security files. You have no right." "Sit down, Mr. Simmons," Frank ordered. "We have every right. It's all in the warrant." Simmons sat back down, his face now pale. He knew he was in serious trouble. Susan finished reading Simmons his rights. "Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you?" she asked. Simmons nodded silently. "I need a verbal answer," Susan said firmly. "Yes, I understand," Simmons muttered. Susan looked at Frank. "What now?" "Now we take Simmons downtown for booking," Frank said. "And we take all these files as evidence. Good work, everyone." As two agents led Simmons out of his office in handcuffs, Susan felt a sense of completion. Both Wright and Simmons would face justice for what they had done. The women they had harassed and threatened would see that speaking up could make a difference. The system had failed these women before, but it wouldn't fail them this time. Susan helped the other agents collect the files from Simmons' office. Each file represented a woman who had been brave enough to file a complaint, only to be silenced by threats. Susan was determined to contact each of them and let them know that their voices would finally be heard. 3 months had passed since the arrests of Paul Wright and Edward Simmons. Susan sat in a courtroom watching as the judge prepared to announce the sentences. The trial had lasted 2 weeks. Both men had been found guilty of all charges. Wright had been convicted of sexual harassment, abuse of power, and inappropriate conduct. Simmons had been convicted of obstruction of justice, blackmail, and conspiracy to cover up crimes. The courtroom was full. Many of the women who had filed complaints against Wright were there. They wanted to see justice done. Some of them had testified during the trial, sharing their experiences with Wright's harassment and Simmons's threats. Their stories had been powerful and convincing. Susan sat next to Frank in the front row. She felt proud of what they had accomplished. This case had started with one undercover operation, but it had grown into something much bigger. It had exposed a system that allowed harassment to continue without consequences. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Helen Carter, cleared her throat. The room went quiet. "In the case of the United States versus Paul Wright, I have considered the evidence presented and the jury's verdict," Judge Carter said. "Mr. Wright, please stand." Wright stood up slowly. He looked much older than he had 3 months ago. His face was pale, and his shoulders were slumped. He knew he was facing serious time in prison. "Paul Wright, you have been found guilty of using your position as a TSA officer to sexually harass female travelers," Judge Carter said. "You abused your power and violated the trust placed in you by the public. Your actions caused harm to many, women who were simply trying to travel safely." Wright stared at the floor, not meeting the judge's eyes. "I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release," Judge Carter announced. "You will also be required to register as a sex offender, and you will never again work in any position of authority or security." A murmur went through the courtroom. 5 years was a significant sentence. The women who had been harassed by Wright looked satisfied with the punishment. Now, in the case of the United States versus Edward Simmons, Judge Carter continued. "Mr. Simmons, please stand." Simmons stood up. Unlike Wright, he still looked defiant. He had maintained throughout the trial that he had done nothing wrong, that he was just protecting his employees from false accusations. The jury hadn't believed him. "Edward Simmons, you have been found guilty of using your position to cover up crimes committed by officers under your supervision," Judge Carter said. "You blackmailed women who came forward with legitimate complaints. You threatened them and violated their privacy. Your actions allowed the harassment to continue and prevented victims from receiving justice." Simmons shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release," Judge Carter said. "Additionally, you will pay a fine of $100,000, which will be distributed among the victims of the harassment you helped cover up." 8 years. That was even longer than Wright's sentence. Susan glanced at Frank, who nodded in approval. Simmons's crimes were in many ways worse than Wright's. He had abused his power on a larger scale and for a longer time. "This court is adjourned," Judge Carter said, banging her gavel. As the bailiffs led Wright and Simmons away, Susan watched the women in the courtroom. Many of them were hugging each other. Some were crying. These were tears of relief, not sadness. For them, this day marked the end of a difficult journey. Frank touched Susan's arm. "We should go," he said. "There will be reporters outside wanting to talk to us." Susan nodded and followed Frank out of the courtroom. As expected, a group of reporters was waiting in the hallway. They rushed forward when they saw Susan and Frank. "Agent Miller, can you comment on the sentences?" one reporter called out. "Do you think justice was served?" asked another. Susan looked at Frank, who nodded, giving her permission to speak. Susan had become the public face of this case, and the FBI had decided to let her handle most of the press interactions. "I believe the sentences are fair," Susan said. "Both men abused their positions of power in different ways. Both caused harm to innocent women. The judge recognized the seriousness of their actions, and the sentences reflect that." "Will this case change how airports handle harassment complaints?" a reporter asked. "It already has," Susan said. "The Transportation Security Administration has implemented new policies for reporting and investigating harassment claims. There are now independent reviewers who handle these complaints, not just the supervisors of the accused officers." "And what about the women who were blackmailed by Simmons?" another reporter asked. "Will they receive any compensation?" "As you heard, the judge ordered Simmons to pay a substantial fine that will be distributed among the victims," Susan explained. "Additionally, the airport has agreed to settlements with many of the women who filed lawsuits against them for failing to address the harassment." After answering a few more questions, Susan and Frank moved away from the reporters. They walked down the hallway to a quieter area where some of the women who had testified were gathered. Laura Green, one of the first women Susan had met, approached her with a smile. "Thank you, Agent Miller," she said. "Without you, none of this would have happened." "I just did my job," Susan said modestly. "You were the brave ones. You came forward and told your stories, even knowing what Simmons had done to women who complained before. But you believed us," Melissa Jones added, joining the conversation. "That made all the difference." Susan smiled. "I believed you because I experienced what you did. I know how it feels to be treated that way." Diane Rivera, who had been the most reluctant to testify because of Simmons' blackmail attempts, spoke up. "What happens now to all the information Simmons collected on us?" "It's been sealed by court order," Frank explained. "It can't be used by anyone, and after a certain period it will be destroyed. Your privacy is protected." The women looked relieved. They chatted with Susan and Frank for a few more minutes, then said their goodbyes. They were ready to move on with their lives, now that this chapter was closed. Susan and Frank left the courthouse and walked to their car. It was a sunny day, and Susan felt a sense of accomplishment that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Good work on this case, Miller," Frank said as they got into the car. "Really good work." "Thanks," Susan said. "But it's not over yet." Frank looked at her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" "During the investigation, we found evidence that similar harassment patterns exist at other airports," Susan explained. "The same problems with complaints being ignored or covered up, the same abuse of power." Frank nodded slowly. "You want to expand the investigation?" "I think we need to. Susan said. This isn't just about Wright and Simmons. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to continue. We've made changes at LaGuardia, but what about all the other airports? Frank started the car and thought for a moment. You're right, he said finally. I'll talk to the director about forming a special task force. Would you be interested in leading it? Susan hadn't expected that. Leading a task force would be a big step up in her career. It would mean more responsibility, but also more opportunity to make real changes. Yes, she said. I would be very interested. Good, Frank said with a smile. I'll recommend you for the position. As they drove away from the courthouse, Susan looked out the window at the city passing by. What had started as one undercover assignment had turned into something much bigger. She had helped bring 2 criminals to justice, but more importantly, she had given a voice to women who had been silenced. Susan knew that the work ahead would be challenging. Changing a deeply rooted system was never easy, but she was ready for it. She would continue to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. That was why she had joined the FBI in the first place. And today, she was reminded of why her job mattered.